From the very beginning, FDR presented a stark contrast with Herbert Hoover. FDR was determined to do something, just as he had done as governor of New York. He was not afraid to experiment. He assembled all kinds of different programs. If something didn't work, he would trash it and start over and do something else. But he was not going to sit back and simply allow the Great Depression to dictate terms. He brought with him to the White House many of his associates from New York. He worked comfortably with those people around him in his close advisory circle. And he also had huge majorities in both houses of Congress, which became very important because it allowed him to pass very quickly and readily almost any program that he and his team drew up. They would sail right through Congress. And so it is under these conditions that FDR and his team put together what comes to be known as the first New Deal. The emphasis on these early programs was relief and recovery. This was an emergency. The nation was in a crisis. And so the programs of the first New Deal concentrated on feeding the hungry, feeding the starving, getting people back to work, resolving the crisis in the banks, easing the struggles of farmers, and a number of these other just vital kinds of issues. So remember that for now, file it away, because when we talk about the second New Deal, which comes a few years later, the emphasis is slightly different. But for now, the emphasis during the first New Deal is this emergency, relief and recovery. Many of the programs of the first New Deal are passed during a special session that FDR calls into Congress immediately upon becoming president. This is known as the 100 days, the first 100 days of FDR's presidency. And it leads to several dozen new programs that become collectively the first New Deal. They are also in some ways the bane of history students' existence. They've been nicknamed the alphabet soup because each agency has its own abbreviation, and it can be overwhelming to try to master the several dozen different acts. So I'll try to make it manageable for you as we go through, thinking primarily about several different categories which these acts are designed to help. And in the first case, it is the economy, the crisis in the stock market, the crisis in the banks. And we'll talk about several other categories as we go. But among the very first things that the Congress passed during the 100 days were several acts related to the economy. The very first one was called the Emergency Banking Relief Act. This was designed, obviously, to help with the crisis in the banks. What it did was shut down every bank in the country for 4 days. And during those 4 days, federal inspectors canvassed the country, going into all of the banks, looking in the books, checking out the vault, seeing how much money was there. And if the bank passed inspection, then it was allowed to reopen at the end of those 4 days. Only about half of the banks in the country reopened at the end of those 4 days, and some banks never reopened at all. They never passed inspection. But those that did had the federal stamp of approval, and the American people could put their money back into the banks with confidence, knowing that federal inspectors had come out and checked everything out, and this bank is sound, and my money will be safe here. So it goes a long way in restoring the confidence in the banks. 2 months later, Congress added the Glass-Steagall Banking Act, which created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC. That might be an abbreviation you recognize even now. It's still on every bank in the country, and if you see a bank that doesn't have it, don't put your money in there. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, that does just that. It insures any of your deposits. The federal government will back up your money. At that time, the limit was up to $5,000. I believe the limit today is $250,000, which it would be guaranteed by the federal government. And a few months later, still, the government passed the Securities Act, which was similarly intended to restore confidence in the stock exchange. It created the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, which, again, still exists today, still very important today. It's the body that oversees the stock exchange. And it creates all kinds of regulations that still exist now. Companies have to submit quarterly reports, and they have to meet certain standards. And so if their symbol is listed on the stock exchange, you and I, as investors and as consumers, can have faith that that company has passed muster. It's got a certain degree of credibility and reliability. So these kinds of programs very rapidly restore the confidence of the American people in the banks and in the stock market, and people begin taking their money out from under the mattress and putting it back into the banks, back into the stock market, where it can resume circulating and keeping the economy humming along. A second category of New Deal programs were those intended to assist in the problem of unemployment. They created jobs. There were several of these kinds of programs, but the most famous of them, perhaps, is the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. This program ultimately put to work more than 500,000 young men. And as you see in the poster and on the PowerPoint list there, putting young men to work on federal work projects. They are building roads. They are engaged in agricultural projects, environmental projects, fire protection kinds of projects. And one of the other significant projects that they engage in all around the country are in building all the facilities associated with national parks and state parks. And so they're building the roadways and fences and the actual buildings and cabins and park benches and all kinds of things like that. If any of you should happen to go to the Lake Greenwood State Park, that is a CCC park. It was built during the years of the CCC. And there's actually a pretty nice little museum there at Lake Greenwood State Park about the CCC and explaining the kinds of things that they did. These young men were paid roughly $1 a day, $30 a month for their work on these projects. But most of their needs were met by the program itself. They were set up with housing. They were given uniforms and clothes to work in. Their meals were provided for them. So almost all of this money is just extra money. And actually, the way the program was set up, typically the young man working on the CCC would receive $5 each month out of that $30. And the other $25 was automatically sent home to their family. And so it's very important to note that one of the things this project is doing, not only are they accomplishing lots of important kinds of projects, but the money is going home to their parents and siblings and helping those people to get by. So a final result of this that I want to point out to you is that it is creating a huge pool of voters who are going to vote faithfully for FDR throughout the rest of his presidency. 500,000 jobs, 500,000 young men working on these projects. Who are they going to vote for? In all likelihood, FDR. But not only that, their parents who are receiving the $25 checks, who are they going to vote for? FDR. Their siblings, perhaps grandparents. Americans come to feel an incredible sense of loyalty and obligation to FDR, unlike any president in our history has ever had. Americans feel like they owe FDR, in some cases, their very lives. He has saved their life. And so, of course, they're going to vote for him in the next election. So this is part of our answer as to how FDR manages to achieve such an impressive level of popularity and maintain that popularity throughout his presidency. Another of the areas of need addressed by the first New Deal was simply that, need, desperation. Those who were unemployed, those who were off of the employment rolls, and trickle-down wasn't doing any good. And so for people like this, FDR created the Emergency Relief Administration. It was created by the Federal Emergency Relief Act. It was headed up by one of FDR's closest advisors, a friend who had worked with him back in New York, whose name was Harry Hopkins. Hopkins, incidentally, was also a very, very close friend and advisor of Eleanor Roosevelt throughout her life. This act created the dole, created handouts for the needy. It is simply a program where those people who are on the brink of starvation and desperation and have no other means can go and get a direct handout. This is the sort of assistance that Hoover never supported and never authorized. But it becomes vital for those who are sort of off of the bottom rung of the economic ladder. Another area of need that the first New Deal addresses are the plight of farmers. And the act that applies here is the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA. The goal of this act was to achieve parity with farm prices from the year 1914. Think about where we are, almost 20 years past that point. But farmers wanted to go back to 1914 and have their prices at that same level. And so the way that the AAA hoped to achieve this was reducing the amount of supply of these farm goods that was reaching the market. Does this sound at all familiar to you? You should have in your ears echoing what I described about Milo Reno and the Farmers Holiday Association. It's the same idea, only now done on a national scale. Under the AAA, farmers slaughtered 6 million baby pigs, plowed under 10 million acres of cotton, and countless other crops destroyed, in many cases just as they were coming to harvest. And so the farmer is paid for all of these goods, but does not bring them to market. This also creates one of the unsettling realities of the Great Depression, which is that there are people starving in the streets at the same time that we are slaughtering and destroying 6 million pigs. Could you not use the pigs to feed the starving? And the answer, of course, is yes, you could, but that would not have resolved the problem of the plight of the farmers and farm prices and so on. One of the other issues with the Agricultural Adjustment Act is that it was ruled by the Supreme Court to be unconstitutional in a 1935 decision in the case of U.S. versus Butler. It's something of a technicality, but it's in the nature of the way the program was funded, which is that early on it would tax sort of wealthy industrial large farms or processing plants and then send that money directly to the smaller farmers who needed it. And in this case, Butler was one of these farm processors who refused to pay his taxes on those grounds. And the Supreme Court actually sided with Butler. And so the AAA was thrown out. It was ruled unconstitutional. We will talk a little bit later about the process that comes next. Similar kinds of programs would then have to be recreated, keeping the good parts and eliminating the unconstitutional parts. But this is also one instance that creates a great deal of ire between FDR and the Supreme Court. He has some real problems with the court overturning his acts. And so we will talk later about the outcome of that. Another of the famous acts of the first New Deal was the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. This is directed primarily at the issue of unemployment as well. Like the CCC, we might say that it put to work hundreds of thousands of young men on federal projects. But it has other advantages as well, and the kinds of projects were a little bit different from the CCC, because one of the things it attempted to do was to kind of bring up to the times a part of the country that at that time, and even in some ways today, was sort of notoriously backward or behind the times. And that is the region of the Tennessee River Valley. We think about places like West Virginia, the uplands of Tennessee, the hilly mountains of Virginia, parts of North Carolina, and places like that. And so the Tennessee Valley Authority would build dams to wire in electricity into these parts of the country. It was also engaged in programs providing flood control, fertilizer, and some other kind of agricultural supplies, recreation facilities, efforts against erosion, and so on. This was one of the signature and one of the favorite programs of the first New Deal. And what we will see is that because of the successes of the TVA, other similar kinds of programs were designed for other parts of the country, particularly parts of the American West.